I'm not going to waste anybody's time. Most of the stuff on this list is just going to be borderline useless. Only reason I'm talking about it is because I do want to touch on everything as it pertains to the DLC, and that is going to include this stuff. I would obviously like to talk more about the weapons and the spells, but there is going to be a balancing update sometime soon. Hopefully there is at least, because there's lots of stuff that's still really broken and lots of stuff that's underpowered. So once that balancing update does come out, we'll touch on more of the important stuff. But as for today, we're going to cover the tools and the damaging based consumables. I know both of those things kind of work differently. One's finite, one's an infinite use, but they're still somewhat comparable, so we might as well just put them in the same video. Starting off at number 11, the Surging Frenzied Flame. This just throws out a little like Frenzied Flame rock that just shoots out a bunch of these fire-based projectile attacks that go in like a bunch of different directions. They don't really go that far. They don't have any tracking. They just constantly shoot in these different directions. So you're only going to hit enemies if they're like really large, or like you're going to hit them like once every 10 seconds. They do terrible damage. They're not going to have good madness build up either. So even in PvP, this thing is probably just going to suck. Does get scalings in all of your damaging stats except for Arcane. But even if you do have like maximum level, the damage is still awful. Does consume 13 FP. You can hold up to 10, but you can only have like one out at a time. As soon as you throw like a second one on the ground, the first one is going to disappear. So yeah, I would like never use this thing. Number 10, Inid Meat. This thing is just meat that you can throw at an enemy and it does awful damage, does not go very far. It doesn't consume FP, actually gets some amounts of tracking. You do get scalings in strength, intelligence, and arcane, albeit it is like a descaling in all of those stats. So like your total overall damage is going to be horrendous. You can carry up to 40 of them, so you can just keep throwing them and potentially maybe even kill like a small enemy. I don't really know what the purpose is of the meat. It's probably just there for like lore reasons, I guess, because it just sucks as a damaging option. Number 9, the Fire Sprite Stone. This actually shoots out like a fire bouncing ball, kind of like those bouncing lava balls from Mario. Actually does get a C scaling in Intelligence and Faith and an A scaling in Arcane. And at these very high levels, you actually might do some okay amounts of damage for only 7 FP, which is pretty decent. The ball actually does bounce pretty far. The tracking is not going to be anything too crazy. And taking into account the casting speed, how long it takes to get there, the damage is not really worth it. Now against larger bosses, it actually can hit them multiple times, but only like twice. And being that these things scale of Arcane, you're going to have access to like spells because you have the Dragon Communion Seal. And just go spec into a little bit of Faith and you have a bunch of like damaging options that are just going to do way more damage than this thing. So although it does look really cool, it's still not that useful. Number 8, Horned Ban. This is one of the reusable tools in the game. As long as you have FP, you can use this attack over and over again. But for 21 FP, it shoots out this like holy based tracking projectile attack. Actually does like surround the player, and when enemies are nearby, it'll just track towards them. Now the tracking projectile itself actually can travel pretty fast, does get very nice tracking, but the damage is just not that good at all. It is just terrible damage. And combined with the fact that it consumes 21 FP and has a very long casting animation, it's just not worth it. Like it does scale off intelligence and faith, but it only gets a descaling in those stats. Like in the gameplay you're seeing right now, I have 60 in both intelligence and faith, and I have the braided cord robe, which this chest piece actually boosts the damage of this tool by 15%. And as you can see, the damage is still bad. It's just terrible. Number 7, Glinting Nail. This is going to be a finite item. You can only hold up to 10 of these things, and every single time that you use it, it basically shoots out a glintstone nail, just one of them. And it does only consume 4 FP, does scale off the intelligence stat, and the damage can be okay. Now, it's obviously not going to be anywhere near as good as the damage of like regular spells, like using like one glintstone nail, or using like a glintstone pebble, carrion slicer. These really cheap spells are just going to do more damage. But the benefit of this one is that you don't need a staff to cast it. But the damage is still not going to be that good to make me want to use it. Like by the time that you actually get to the DLC, you should have a staff that's leveled up if you do have an intelligence build. And in that instance, I'd rather just spend like an extra 3 or 4 more FP to use like a better damaging spell. Number 6, the Sprite Stone and Bond Stone. Now this one actually works very differently than the other types of tools. It requires both a finite version and the reusable version. You throw out like a regular Sprite Stone that you can only hold up to 10 of, and for every single cast it is going to consume 28 FP, but it shoots out this like very slow tracking projectile attack that takes a while to explode as well. It doesn't have proximity detonation, and it takes like about 10 seconds for it to explode, so it's just really not that viable to use it on its own. But there is going to be a tool called the Bond Stone, which is like a reusable item. And when the Sprite Stone is actually out and about, you actually can use the Bond Stone to actually make it explode. I don't know why the Sprite Stone itself just didn't have like proximity detonation. It would have just made more sense, because this way you have to toggle back and forth just to be able to explode it, which can be pretty cool and makes it very interesting. And the damage itself can actually be very nice. This thing does scale primarily off Arcane, and it can get some high amounts of damage in a large AoE. But for 28 FP, for how long it takes to cast, and how long it takes to actually use the animation to make it explode too, it's just not worth using. Like, it's a very cool concept, but but it could have just been way better, because as it stands right now, if you have an arcane build, you're better off just using spells with the Dragon Communion Seal. Number 5, the Charming branch. This is identical to the Bewitching branch in every single way, in that it actually does turn enemies into allies, so you actually can use it against some random trash mobs, and they'll end up like fighting allies for you, which obviously does sound pretty cool. Now the differences being is that the Charming branch actually does consume more than twice the amount of FP, but it does actually work in an AoE, so if you are surrounded by a bunch of enemies, you could just use this item and you could just turn a whole bunch of them against the other enemies. I think its main use is going to be in PvP, serving as like an anti-invasion tool, but it still can get some nice uses in PvE, albeit it is still going to be pretty niche due to how hard it is to actually craft some of these things too. Number 4, the Call of Tibia. This is another finite tool, which for 14 FP does actually summon a skeleton that actually can swing a bunch of times. So it is actually comparable to Tibia's summon spell, but this one is actually better than that, because the animation is just like a throwing attack, which is going to be faster. The skeleton gets like better tracking, it gets better stun lock, and for only 14 FP too. It does only get like a descaling in both intelligence and faith, but if you are at these higher levels, you can just like throw a whole bunch of these and they can just do some nice damage, and they're very fun to use as well. Now, once again, if you are at these higher levels and you have a faith and intelligence based build, there is going to be other better spell based options that you could just use instead. But if you did want to go into like a necromancer build and you just didn't like Tibia summons because it sucks, then you could go ahead and try and farm for these. Number 3, Fire Coil. This is another finite item that actually can be thrown as a little fire-based projectile attack. It does actually get an S scaling in the Faith. It only consumes 9 FP, and the damage itself is actually pretty decent. It actually is very comparable to Fire Serpent, but actually can do more damage than that, and actually for less FP. Now, Fire Serpent is going to be like a faster animation, does get better tracking, and you can just use Fire Serpent as much as you want as long as you do have FP, whereas for Fire Coil, you can only throw it 10 times. But if you did want to save yourself a spell slot, you could just use these as like a quick fire-based projectile option. And also, these things are very easily craftable. It only requires like 1 crafting material, and they're very easy to farm. So it's not like they're going to be like a bad damaging option, it's just that they scale off Faith, and be that you already have a Faith build, you might as well just use the spells instead. Number 2, Dragon Communion Harpoon. This actually is going to be a finite item that throws out a big giant spear, and this spear can actually go very far, do some nice damage, also does get bonus damage against dragons, does get an A scaling in strength, a C scaling in dexterity, and with these like higher level strength builds or the quality build, it can actually put in some work against bosses. It does also get boosted by things like the smithing talisman and the spear talisman. It also can be fully charged to make it do even more damage. And as you can see, it actually is pretty decent. Now, the major problem being is that you only can hold up to 5 of these things at a time. I wish you could hold at least 10, because you could just do some decent chunk damage with a strength-based projectile attack that's not going to consume any FP. And it is very easy to use as well. So you could just like start off a boss fight just by spamming these, and it could just set you up very nicely. Now, another unfortunate thing about this tool is that it does take a while to actually farm for them. The materials that it does require to craft are pretty rare. There are going to be some farming methods out there, but it's not really worth it in my opinion. Number 1, the Perfumed Oil of Rana, to which I consider this one to be the best tool in the game and probably the most useful item on this list, which is not saying much, but I still think it's pretty good. Now, this actually is going to be an infinite use tool, meaning that you don't have to farm for anything. As long as you have FP, you can just use this infinitely. And it does work very similar to the Flame of the Redmane's Asher War. It does shoot at like a horizontal spread of a fire attack. It does also only consume 13 FP, but best of all yet, it actually scales off dexterity. It gets an A scaling in dex, so if you have a dexterity based build, you're not really going to have access to things like spells, because there's no like staff or seal that scale off dexterity. And typically dexterity builds only get access to things like lightning damage also. So not only does this actually give you a fire damaging option, but it gives you a projectile option that can hit multiple enemies and actually does somewhat decent damage. I wouldn't use this thing as like a primary option, but if you do get surrounded by a bunch of trash mobs, you could just use this to clean them all up. Or if you go up against those enemies weaker to fire damage, this could just perform nicely too. It's not going to be like the most amazing thing or the highest damaging thing in the game, but if you do have a dexterity build, you might as well just equip this thing because it is pretty useful. Anyway, that is the list now done. Sorry if this felt like a filler or like useless type of video, but I can guarantee there are people who are going to be asking me questions about this type of stuff, so making a video does serve as a benefit. Now, in terms of the next video, we are still going to be talking about the consumables, but I am going to be talking about the buffs and the transformations this time, which thankfully there's going to be a lot more interesting stuff on that list. So definitely do subscribe for that. Anyway, catch you guys around. Bye.